The social hierarchy of the Roman Empire was incredibly complicated, so I've broken it down into a couple of simple steps. The patricians were usually the ruling class, maybe an emperor or, say, a royal family. Senators were the people below the patricians, who worked in the Senate, the government of the time. After senators were the equestrians, literally the cavalry, many of whom were wealthy businessmen under the senators. Then came the common folk, the working class, who were sometimes rich, but they were all citizens. Then came the freedmen, who were usually slaves that had been freed by their masters. Often they became common people, but some made a large amount of wealth. Then the slaves, who were just slaves, not paid, not allowed to vote, not free. One of the main associations of a freedman was his patron, a person who would give favours or food and money for loyalty. Thus the freedman now became the client, and patronus meaning patron and cliens meaning client. A freedman might have to give favours in return, or escort the patron on his day-to-day activities. When a freedman was freed, he would take his former master's first and middle name, keeping his last name the same. If he was freed by a woman, he would take her father's names instead. Also, his former master would usually become his patron. A freedman now had the rights to a vote, with some restrictions. Most people did not have a problem with freedmen, they had earned their freedom. But when a freedman became rich or influential, many people had ill feelings towards them and looked down upon them. Freedmen were men, usually Greeks, who had come to Rome. Rich Romans employed them as secretaries, accountants, and doctors. After a time, these men gained their real freedom and became real freedmen, allowing them to move on and away, but many still tended to stay on as household officials. The imperial household was no different, except that the emperor's freedmen ran the Roman Empire, not just the family estates. Despite their importance, freedmen were social outcasts. They were despised as former slaves, and they were hated as foreigners. Claudius was hardly the first emperor to use freedmen to help with the day-to-day running of the empire. He was, however, forced to increase their role as the powers of the princeps, the chiefs, became more centralized and the burden larger. This was partially due to the ongoing hostility of the Senate, but also due to his respect for the senators. Claudius did not want free-born magistrates to have to serve under him, as if they were not his peers. The secretariat was divided into bureaus, with each being placed under the leadership of one freedman. Narcissus was the secretary of correspondence, Pallas became the secretary of the treasury, Callistus became the secretary of justice. There was a fourth bureau for miscellaneous issues, which was put under Polybus, until his execution for treason. The freedmen could also speak for the emperor, as when Narcissus addressed the troops in Claudius's stead before the conquest of Britain. Since these were important positions, the senators were aghast at their being placed in the hands of former slaves. If freedmen had total control of money, letters, and law, it seemed it would not be hard for them to manipulate the emperor. This is exactly the accusation put forth by the ancient sources. However, these same sources admit that the freedmen were loyal to Claudius. The tension caused between the emperor, his freedmen, and the senators was apparently not a problem for Claudius. He was appreciative of them, and gave them due credit for the policies where he had used their advice. However, if they showed treasonous inclinations, the emperor did punish them with just force, as in the case of Polybius and Pallas' brother Felix. There is no evidence that the characters of Claudius's policies and edicts changed with the rise and fall of the various freedmen, suggesting that he was firmly in control throughout his time in office. Marcus Antonius Pallas, 1-63 CE, was a prominent Greek freedman and secretary during the reigns of the Roman emperors Claudius and Nero. Pallas was originally a slave of Antonia Minor, a daughter of Mark Antony and niece of Emperor Augustus. Pallas took her name when freed. Josephus mentions him as the slave sent by Antonia to deliver evidence to the Emperor Tiberius concerning the murders of his son Julius Caesar Drusus by Sendius. Antonia probably manumitted Pallas between the year of 31 and 37, when he would have passed the minimum age for freedom. He is listed as owning land in Egypt during that period, possibly as a reward for his servitude. When Antonia died in 37, he became the client for her son, Claudius, as tradition dictated at the death of a former master and patron. As a freedman, Pallas rose to great heights in the imperial government. From the beginning of Claudius's reign, the Senate was openly hostile to him, which forced him to centralize powers. The daily maintenance of the empire was too much for one man, so Claudius divided up amongst his trusted freedmen. Pallas was made Secretary of the Treasury. He did this job with sufficient efficiency that Cornelius Scipio proposed before the Senate that he be rewarded. The position apparently enabled Pallas to reward himself as well, as he is later listed as one of the richest men of the time by Pliny the Elder. In the second half of Claudius's reign, Pallas chose to support Agrippina the Younger as new empress after the fall of Empress Melusina. Tacitus notes he is intent to reunite the Julian and Claudian families through the marriage, and prevent either a future husband of Agrippina or Agrippina herself from claiming the throne. But the ancient authors also state that the real reason for his choice was that Pallas and Agrippina were lovers. According to Tacitus, Tiberius Claudius Narcissus, another powerful freedman at the court, hoped to bring down Agrippina by revealing her alleged affair with Pallas, which would have also undermined the position of her son Nero. Narcissus had allied himself with Britannicus, Nero's principal competitor for the succession. When Nero succeeded Claudius, Narcissus was arrested and executed. Pallas retained his position in the treasury for a time. It suggested that he assisted Agrippina in murdering Claudius, since he was sure of his future security. This security did not last long. In 55, Nero dismissed Pallas from service, tired of having to deal with any allies of Agrippina.